Ryan Smith stared at the foreclosure notice, trembling in his hands, knowing he had exactly 72 hours to come up with $47,000, or lose the only home his three daughters had ever known. His family had spent months mocking him for accepting his late Uncle Theodore's generous gift, a century-old house in Millbrook Heights with a basement that had been flooded for over 2 decades. But when Ryan finally decided to pump out that stagnant, foul-smelling water, what they discovered hidden beneath would make his family's mockery turn to stunned silence and transform their lives in ways none of them could have ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of March 15th brought the kind of bone-chilling rain that seemed to seep into your soul, perfectly matching Ryan Smith's mood as he sat at his kitchen table in the small rental house on Elmwood Street in Millbrook Heights, Connecticut. At 48 years old, Ryan had never imagined his life would come to this, staring at official documents that would soon make him and his 3 daughters homeless. The foreclosure notice bore the cold, impersonal letterhead of Pinnacle Banking Corporation, demanding immediate payment of $47,000 in back mortgage payments, late fees, and legal costs. After losing his job as a quality control supervisor at Henderson Manufacturing Company 8 months ago, Ryan had burned through his savings, maxed out credit cards, and borrowed money from anyone willing to help. His unemployment benefits had run out 6 weeks ago, and despite sending out over 200 job applications, the economic downturn in their small Connecticut town had left him competing with dozens of other desperate workers for every available position. His eldest daughter, Madison, was a senior at Millbrook Heights High School, just 3 months away from graduation and acceptance to Central Connecticut State University on a partial academic scholarship. At 18, she worked evenings at Cooper's Diner to help with family expenses, but her $8.50 an hour couldn't make a dent in their mounting debts. Her younger sisters, 16-year-old Sophia and 14-year-old Emma, had watched their father's optimism slowly drain away over the past months, replacing his usual encouragement with worried silences and late-night pacing through their small house. The girls' mother, Jennifer, had passed away from cancer 4 years earlier, leaving Ryan to raise 3 teenagers on a single income while managing medical bills that continued to arrive long after the funeral. Jennifer's life insurance had covered her final medical expenses, but there was nothing left to provide financial security for the family she'd worked so hard to protect. Ryan's extended family had made their opinions about his situation painfully clear during recent months. His brother Marcus, a successful real estate developer in Hartford, had offered hollow sympathy while making it clear that Ryan's financial struggles were the result of poor planning and lack of ambition. His sister Carol, married to a prosperous dentist, had suggested that Ryan's problems would disappear if he simply worked harder and stopped making excuses. But the cruelest mockery had come when Ryan's Uncle Theodore passed away 6 months ago, leaving his nephew an inheritance that seemed designed more as punishment than generosity. Uncle Theodore Blackwood had been the family eccentric, a reclusive man who had spent 43 years living alone in a deteriorating Victorian house at 1847 Sycamore Lane on the outskirts of Millbrook Heights. The house had been built in 1892 by Theodore's grandfather, Cornelius Blackwood, a successful textile merchant who had designed the property with unusual architectural features that reflected his European travels and taste for the dramatic. The most dramatic feature was the basement, a cavernous space that had been flooded since 1999 when a combination of spring storms and a failed drainage system had turned the lower level into what locals jokingly called Theodore's Indoor Lake. For 24 years, Uncle Theodore had simply abandoned the basement, sealing it off and pretending the problem didn't exist. The stagnant water had developed a smell that could be detected throughout the house, contributing to Theodore's reputation as the neighborhood's most mysterious and slightly unsettling resident. When Theodore's will was read at the law offices of Pemberton & Associates, Ryan learned that he had inherited the entire property, the house, the 3-acre lot, and most significantly, the flooded basement that would require thousands of dollars to properly remediate. The attorney, Harold Pemberton, had delivered the news with the apologetic tone of someone announcing a terminal diagnosis. Ryan's family had reacted with a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed amusement. Marcus had actually laughed out loud in the lawyer's office, suggesting that Uncle Theodore had found a way to burden Ryan with expenses even from beyond the grave. Carol had shaken her head with exaggerated sympathy, commenting that Ryan's luck seemed to specialize in making bad situations worse. Even Ryan's daughters had struggled to find anything positive about inheriting a house that smelled like swamp water and required more renovation money than their family could earn in several years. Madison had calculated that the cost of pumping out the basement, treating water damage, and making the house livable would exceed $30,000, money they obviously didn't have. For months, Ryan had avoided dealing with the inherited property, focusing instead on finding employment and keeping his family housed in their rental home. The Victorian house on Sycamore Lane sat empty, its flooded basement growing more stagnant, while Ryan wrestled with impossible financial mathematics. But now, holding the foreclosure notice with its unforgiving deadline, Ryan realized he was out of options. His brother Marcus had made it clear that no more family loans would be forthcoming. His job search had yielded nothing but polite rejections and automated responses. His landlord, Mrs. Patricia Holloway, had been patient for months, but could no longer carry a tenant who hadn't paid rent since October. The only asset Ryan possessed was Uncle Theodore's bizarre inheritance, a moldering house with a basement full of 24-year-old floodwater. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe, if he could somehow pump out the basement and make the house minimally habitable, he could move his family there temporarily while continuing his job search. It would be difficult, uncomfortable, and probably embarrassing, but it would keep his daughters from becoming homeless. Ryan looked at his phone's clock. 6:47 a.m. Madison would be getting ready for school, Sophia would be complaining about her algebra homework, and Emma would be searching for matching socks in the laundry basket. In 72 hours, if he couldn't produce $47,000, all of their routines would end forever. Time to pump out Uncle Theodore's basement and see what 24 years of stagnant water had been hiding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ryan Smith had never imagined that desperation could feel so heavy, like carrying stones in your chest that grew heavier with each passing hour. As he drove his rusted 2009 Honda Civic through the winding streets of Millbrook Heights toward Uncle Theodore's abandoned house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make another in a long series of decisions that would only deepen his family's troubles. The house at 1847 Sycamore Lane sat like a monument to neglect, its once grand Victorian architecture now hidden beneath peeling paint, sagging gutters, and windows clouded with decades of accumulated grime. The wraparound porch that had once been the envy of the neighborhood now tilted at angles that defied both physics and building codes. Wild ivy had claimed the eastern wall, creating patterns that looked more like green scars than decorative landscaping. Ryan parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the inheritance that his family had spent months treating as an elaborate practical joke. His brother Marcus had actually suggested that Uncle Theodore's will was evidence of senile dementia, a final act of confusion from a man who had spent his last decades talking to cats and hoarding newspapers. Carol had been even less charitable, describing the inheritance as Theodore's revenge against a family that had never understood his eccentric lifestyle. But Ryan remembered Uncle Theodore differently. As a child, Ryan had visited this house during summer vacations, back when it was still magnificent, and Theodore was still relatively normal. Uncle Theodore had been a bachelor who worked as a librarian at Millbrook Heights Public Library, spending his evenings reading philosophy books and maintaining elaborate gardens that attracted visitors from neighboring towns. He had never married, never had children, and had gradually withdrawn from family gatherings after Ryan's Aunt Catherine died in a car accident in 1987. The transformation from respected librarian to neighborhood eccentric had happened slowly, then all at once. After Catherine's death, Theodore had stopped maintaining the gardens, stopped attending family holidays, and had eventually stopped leaving the house except for essential errands. When the basement flooded in 1999, instead of dealing with the problem, Theodore had simply sealed off the lower level and pretended it didn't exist. For 24 years, that basement had been a source of neighborhood speculation and family embarrassment. Local children had created elaborate stories about what might be lurking in the stagnant water. Teenagers had dared each other to sneak onto the property and listen for strange sounds coming from beneath the house. Adults had whispered about the smell that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the building. Ryan's own daughters had heard these stories throughout their childhood, making Uncle Theodore's house a source of both fascination and revulsion. Madison had actually written a high school English paper about the psychology of abandonment, using Uncle Theodore as a case study, though she had been careful not to include his real name. Sophia had convinced herself that the flooded basement contained the remains of Theodore's pets, a theory that had given her nightmares for months. Emma, the youngest and most practical, had simply declared the entire situation gross and had refused to discuss Uncle Theodore at family gatherings. Now, as Ryan approached the front door with a key that felt heavier than it should, he wondered what Theodore had been thinking when he left this burden to his nephew. Had it been a genuine attempt to help Ryan's family, providing them with property that might someday be valuable? Or had it been something more complicated, a puzzle that Theodore expected Ryan to solve, a test of character that would reveal something important about both the giver and the receiver? The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through empty rooms filled with dusty furniture and the accumulated silence of years spent in isolation. Ryan had visited the house once since Theodore's funeral, conducting a brief walkthrough with his daughters that had left all of them feeling depressed and overwhelmed. The interior retained traces of its former elegance: elaborate crown molding, hardwood floors beneath layers of grime, and windows that would be beautiful if they weren't coated with neglect. But it was impossible to ignore the smell that permeated everything, a damp, organic odor that suggested decay and stagnation. The smell grew stronger as Ryan approached the basement door, a heavy wooden barrier that Theodore had sealed with multiple locks and warning signs that read, "Danger, do not enter," in Theodore's careful librarian handwriting. Ryan had brought basic tools, crowbars, flashlights, and a portable pump that he had borrowed from his neighbor Frank Morrison. Frank had offered the equipment with skeptical enthusiasm, suggesting that Ryan would need industrial equipment to address 24 years of accumulated water damage. The pump was designed for minor flooding, not for draining what was essentially an indoor pond that had been developing its own ecosystem for nearly a quarter-century. As Ryan worked to remove Theodore's locks and warning signs, he found himself thinking about his daughters and the conversation they had shared the previous evening. Madison, ever the practical one, had suggested that they should simply sell the property as is to a developer who specialized in teardowns. The lot was large enough and well located enough to attract buyers who would demolish the house and build something modern and profitable. But Sophia had argued that they owed it to Uncle Theodore's memory to at least attempt to restore the house to something resembling habitability. She had researched Victorian architecture online and had become excited about the possibility of uncovering original features that might be hidden beneath decades of neglect. Emma had characteristically cut through both arguments by pointing out that they didn't have money for restoration or time to wait for a sale that might never materialize. The basement door finally swung open, releasing a wave of humid air that made Ryan's eyes water and his stomach clench. The smell was worse than he had anticipated, a combination of stagnant water, mold, and something organic that he preferred not to identify. His flashlight beam revealed wooden stairs descending into darkness, with water visible about halfway down the staircase. Ryan had expected to see a simple flooded basement, perhaps with floating debris and obvious water damage. What he discovered was far more intriguing and mysterious. The water level was lower than he had anticipated, suggesting that some drainage had occurred over the years. More significantly, the visible portions of the basement walls showed evidence of careful construction that seemed inconsistent with a simple storage area. The stonework was elaborate and precise, featuring arched openings and decorative elements that suggested the basement had been designed for purposes more significant than storing coal or preserving vegetables. Along the visible walls, Ryan could see what appeared to be metal fixtures and mounting brackets that seemed too sophisticated for a typical Victorian basement. As Ryan positioned his borrowed pump and prepared to begin the slow process of draining 24 years of accumulated water, he found himself wondering what Uncle Theodore had really left him. This wasn't just a flooded basement. It was a mystery that had been waiting nearly a quarter-century for someone curious enough and desperate enough to solve it. The pump hummed to life, and Ryan watched the first streams of dark water begin flowing through the discharge hose toward the backyard. Whatever Uncle Theodore had been hiding down there, Ryan was about to discover it. The pump had been running for 6 hours when Ryan first noticed that the water wasn't just draining, it was revealing something extraordinary. What he had initially assumed would be a straightforward cleanup operation had transformed into an archaeological expedition, as each receding inch of murky water exposed features that defied every assumption he had made about Uncle Theodore's basement. By late afternoon, the water level had dropped enough to reveal that the basement wasn't a single large room as Ryan had expected, but rather a complex of interconnected chambers carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. The stonework was masterful, featuring Gothic arches and carved reliefs that looked more like cathedral architecture than utilitarian basement construction. Most intriguingly, several of the exposed walls contained what appeared to be sealed doorways, heavy iron barriers that had been designed to keep something in or someone out. Ryan's borrowed pump was struggling with the volume of water, and it had become clear that he would need industrial equipment to complete the drainage. But what he could see was already revolutionary. The basement extended far beyond the footprint of the house above, suggesting that Uncle Theodore's property contained underground spaces that had been excavated with considerable expense and expertise. The first truly shocking discovery came when Ryan's flashlight illuminated a section of wall near what appeared to be the basement's eastern boundary. Carved into the stone, barely visible beneath decades of mineral deposits and algae growth, were symbols that Ryan recognized from his childhood visits to Theodore's library. They were Masonic emblems, but arranged in patterns that suggested something more complex than simple fraternal organization. Uncle Theodore had never mentioned being a member of any Masonic lodge, and Ryan's family had always assumed that Theodore's interest in history and architecture was purely academic. But the evidence carved into these basement walls suggested that Theodore had been involved in activities that required both significant resources and absolute secrecy. Ryan climbed carefully down the partially drained stairs, testing each step for structural integrity before committing his full weight. The basement floor, where it was visible above the remaining water, consisted of fitted stone blocks arranged in geometric patterns that incorporated the same symbols he had noticed on the walls. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that would have required master stonemasons and considerable financial investment. But it was the discovery near the basement's western wall that made Ryan's hands shake with excitement and confusion. Partially submerged but clearly visible in his flashlight beam was what appeared to be a bronze plaque bearing an inscription in multiple languages. Ryan could make out English, Latin, and what looked like German text, along with a date that made him question everything he thought he knew about his family's history. 1943. The English portion of the plaque read, "Sacred Trust of the Millbrook Sanctuary, Guardians of Cultural Heritage, established by the Emergency Committee for the Preservation of European Treasures." Below this formal inscription, in smaller text, Ryan could see what appeared to be Theodore's own handwriting. "For future generations who will understand the cost of preserving civilization." Ryan's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of what he was discovering. 1943 had been the height of World War II, when Nazi forces were systematically looting art treasures from occupied territories throughout Europe. He remembered reading about efforts by Allied forces and civilian organizations to protect cultural artifacts from destruction or theft. But he had never imagined that such activities might have extended to a small Connecticut town. The possibility that Uncle Theodore had been involved in protecting stolen art from Nazi appropriation seemed fantastical, but the evidence surrounding Ryan was impossible to ignore. The basement's sophisticated construction, the Masonic symbols suggesting organizational connections, and the formal plaque indicating an emergency committee all pointed toward activities far more significant than anything Ryan's family had ever suspected. As Ryan explored the partially drained basement, he discovered additional features that reinforced his growing amazement. Built into the eastern wall was what appeared to be a sophisticated ventilation system, with metal ducts and air circulation equipment that looked far more advanced than anything that should have existed in a 1940s basement. The western wall contained mounting brackets and electrical connections that suggested the space had been designed to house delicate equipment or valuable materials that required climate control. Most significantly, Ryan found evidence that the basement's flooding had not been accidental. Near what appeared to be the main drainage system, he discovered control valves and water diversion channels that had been deliberately operated to flood the space. Someone, presumably Uncle Theodore, had intentionally filled the basement with water, creating a protective barrier that had preserved whatever secrets lay beneath for nearly a quarter century. The realization that Theodore had flooded the basement on purpose changed everything about Ryan's understanding of his inheritance. This wasn't the result of neglect or poor maintenance. It was a deliberate preservation strategy, a way of protecting something so valuable that it was worth sacrificing the habitability of the entire house. Ryan's phone buzzed with a text message from Madison. "Dad, how's the basement cleanup going? Do you need help?" He stared at the message, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't sound completely insane. How could he explain that he wasn't cleaning up flood damage, but rather uncovering what appeared to be a World War II-era preservation facility hidden beneath his uncle's house? Instead of responding immediately, Ryan continued his exploration, documenting everything with his phone's camera while the daylight lasted. Near the basement's northern wall, he discovered something that made his pulse quicken with anticipation and anxiety. Partially concealed by decades of mineral deposits was what appeared to be the outline of a vault door, a massive circular barrier that looked like something from a bank or government facility. The vault door was sealed not just by its original locking mechanism, but by additional barriers that Theodore had installed, concrete reinforcements and metal plating that would have required significant effort to construct. Whatever was behind that door, Theodore had been determined to keep it secure and hidden. As evening approached and the pump continued its slow work, Ryan found himself facing a decision that would determine not just his family's immediate future, but potentially their place in history. The evidence suggested that Uncle Theodore had been the guardian of something extraordinary, something valuable enough to justify decades of secrecy and elaborate protection measures. The flooded basement that his family had mocked as a worthless burden was revealing itself to be a carefully constructed preservation facility. The question now was whether Ryan had the courage and the resources to discover what his uncle had spent his lifetime protecting. The pump hummed steadily in the growing darkness, each gallon of removed water bringing Ryan closer to answers that might change everything he thought he knew about Uncle Theodore, about his family's history, and about the true value of the inheritance that had seemed like such a cruel joke just hours earlier. Standing in the partially drained basement, surrounded by evidence of his uncle's secret life, Ryan realized that tomorrow would bring discoveries that would either vindicate Theodore's decades of mysterious behavior or reveal the elaborate delusions of a man who had spent too many years living alone with his obsessions. But as Ryan climbed back up the basement stairs and prepared to return home to his daughters, he couldn't shake the feeling that Uncle Theodore had been protecting something genuinely extraordinary, something that justified every year of isolation and every deliberate choice to maintain the appearance of being nothing more than the neighborhood's harmless eccentric. The bronze plaque's inscription echoed in his mind, "For future generations who will understand the cost of preserving civilization." Tomorrow, Ryan would discover whether he was the future generation Theodore had been waiting for. Ryan barely slept that night, his mind cycling through images of carved symbols, bronze plaques, and that massive vault door hidden beneath decades of mineral deposits. By dawn, he had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He was going to open Uncle Theodore's vault, regardless of the consequences. The industrial pump rental from Berkshire Equipment Company cost $340 that Ryan couldn't afford, charged to a credit card that was already maxed out. But as he watched the powerful machine drain water at 10 times the rate of his borrowed pump, Ryan understood that some discoveries were worth any financial risk. The basement was revealing itself like an ancient city emerging from a flood, each receding inch of water exposing architectural details that belonged in a museum rather than beneath a deteriorating Victorian house. By noon, the water level had dropped enough to reveal the full scope of Uncle Theodore's secret. The basement wasn't just larger than the house above. It was a complex underground facility that extended beneath the neighboring properties, connected by tunnels that had been carved through solid bedrock with professional expertise. The main chamber alone was roughly the size of a small warehouse, with vaulted ceilings that rose nearly 20 feet above the stone floor. But it was the vault door that commanded Ryan's attention. Now fully exposed, the circular barrier stood 8 feet in diameter and appeared to be constructed from steel that was several inches thick. The manufacturer's nameplate, visible once Ryan had cleaned away the mineral deposits, read, "Mosler Safe Company, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Model 1941 Treasury Class." Ryan's online research revealed that this particular model had been designed for federal government installations and major financial institutions, not for private residences in small Connecticut towns. The combination lock required 6 numbers, and Ryan's initial attempts using significant dates from Theodore's life, birth year, graduation dates, Catherine's death, yielded nothing but the mechanical clicking of tumblers falling back into locked position. But Theodore had been a librarian, a man who understood the importance of preserving information for future discovery. There had to be a clue, a way for the right person to access whatever lay beyond that steel barrier. The answer came from an unexpected source. While photographing the Masonic symbols carved into the eastern wall, Ryan noticed that several of the emblems contained numerical elements, dates, measurements, and reference numbers that seemed to correspond to library cataloging systems. Theodore had hidden the combination in plain sight, embedded within the symbolic decorations that covered the basement walls. Working systematically through the numerical sequences, Ryan finally heard the satisfying click of tumblers aligning correctly. The massive vault door, despite its age and decades of humid storage, swung open with the smooth precision of German engineering, revealing an interior that made Ryan's knees weak with amazement. The vault contained 3 distinct sections, each representing a different aspect of Uncle Theodore's secret mission. The first area housed document storage systems that looked like something from a government archive, fireproof filing cabinets, climate-controlled display cases, and organizational systems that suggested decades of careful cataloging and preservation work. But it was the second section that revealed the true scope of Theodore's activities. Mounted on custom-built display racks were dozens of paintings, each wrapped in protective materials and stored according to museum-quality preservation standards. Even through the protective coverings, Ryan could see evidence of masterful artwork, oil paintings with rich colors and sophisticated techniques that suggested significant age and value. The third section of the vault contained something even more extraordinary. Gold bars, each stamped with markings that Ryan recognized from history documentaries about World War II. Nazi gold, systematically looted from occupied territories and concentration camps, now stored in carefully organized rows within Uncle Theodore's secret preservation facility. Ryan's hands trembled as he examined the documentation that Theodore had maintained with librarian precision. Inventory lists, provenance records, and correspondence files revealed the scope of an operation that had begun in 1943 and continued until Theodore's death 6 months earlier. Uncle Theodore hadn't just been protecting stolen art and Nazi gold, he had been part of an international network dedicated to recovering cultural treasures and ensuring their eventual return to rightful owners or appropriate institutions. The correspondence files contained letters from museums, government agencies, and survivor organizations throughout Europe and North America. Theodore had been in contact with the World Jewish Congress, the FBI's art crime team, and various international organizations dedicated to Holocaust asset recovery. But the letters also revealed something that explained Theodore's decades of secrecy. Several of the Nazi officers involved in the original looting had survived the war and established new identities in America, some settling in Connecticut, and continuing to search for the assets they considered their personal property. Ryan discovered detailed surveillance reports that Theodore had compiled over decades, documenting the activities of at least 6 individuals living within 50 miles of Millbrook Heights who had been SS officers, concentration camp administrators, or collaborators in the systematic theft of Jewish cultural property. These men had spent decades trying to recover what they considered their stolen wealth, and Theodore had spent those same decades protecting the evidence that would expose their war crimes and ensure the return of stolen property to legitimate claimants. The most shocking revelation came in a sealed envelope marked "For my heir, open only in emergency." Inside, Ryan found a letter that explained not just Theodore's mission but the specific danger that had made his secrecy necessary. "My dear nephew, if you are reading this, then I have failed to complete the work that has consumed my adult life. The assets in this vault represent approximately $280 million in recovered Nazi plunder, artwork stolen from Jewish families, gold bars looted from national treasuries, and documents that prove the war crimes of men who have lived comfortable lives in America while their victims' families struggled to rebuild from nothing. I have spent 43 years protecting these assets while gathering evidence against the criminals who stole them. Some of these men are still alive, still powerful, and still searching for what they consider their property. They know that someone in this area has been working against them, but they have never identified me as the source of their frustration. The flooding of this basement was not accidental. It was my final protection against discovery. But the work must be completed. The artwork must be returned to the families from whom it was stolen. The gold must be transferred to Holocaust survivor organizations. And the criminals who have escaped justice for 78 years must finally face consequences for their actions. You will find complete documentation of their current identities, addresses, and activities in the files marked Active Surveillance. Be careful, nephew. These men have killed to protect their secrets before, and they will not hesitate to kill again if they discover that their stolen wealth is within reach of recovery. Ryan sat in the vault, surrounded by $280 million in recovered Nazi plunder, trying to process the magnitude of what Uncle Theodore had accomplished and the responsibility he had now inherited. This wasn't just about financial salvation for his family. It was about completing a mission of historical justice that had required 4 decades of dangerous, solitary work. The basement that his family had mocked as a worthless burden contained enough evidence to rewrite the history of Nazi war crimes in America. But it also contained enough danger to destroy anyone who wasn't prepared for the consequences of exposing men who had spent 78 years building new lives on foundations of theft and murder. Ryan's phone buzzed with another text from Madison. "Dad, you've been gone all day. Everything okay?" He stared at the message, knowing that everything had changed forever. His family was about to become either very wealthy or very dead, depending on how carefully he handled Uncle Theodore's final mission. Standing in a vault filled with stolen masterpieces and Nazi gold, Ryan understood that he was no longer just trying to save his house. He was trying to complete one of the most important justice operations in modern American history. Ryan spent the next morning in Uncle Theodore's vault, methodically photographing every document, every piece of artwork, and every gold bar, while trying to comprehend the full scope of what his uncle had discovered. The inventory lists revealed artifacts that museums around the world had been searching for since 1945. Paintings by Degas, Monet, and Picasso that had been presumed destroyed. Sculptures that had vanished from private collections in Paris and Vienna, and religious artifacts stolen from synagogues across occupied Europe. But it was Theodore's surveillance files that revealed the true magnitude of the conspiracy he had spent decades unraveling. The Active Surveillance folder contained detailed dossiers on individuals who had reinvented themselves as respected American citizens while concealing their roles in one of history's most systematic theft operations. Heinrich Müller, now known as Henry Miller, had become a successful antique dealer in Hartford, using his expertise in European art to build a legitimate business that provided perfect cover for his continued search for the assets he had stolen as an SS Oberfuhrer. Theodore's files contained photographs of Miller attending charity galas, serving on museum boards, and maintaining the public persona of a cultured European immigrant who had escaped Nazi persecution. Klaus Richter had transformed himself into Charles Richardson, establishing a construction company in Waterbury that had grown into one of Connecticut's largest development firms. Richardson had used his wealth and influence to purchase properties throughout the region, conducting what appeared to be legitimate real estate development while actually searching for possible hiding places where stolen assets might have been concealed. But the most shocking revelation was the identity of the man who had orchestrated the entire American operation. SS Standartenführer Wolfgang von Habsburg had become William Habsburg, a philanthropist and political donor whose foundation had contributed millions to Connecticut political campaigns over the past 30 years. Habsburg had used his charitable activities to gain access to local government officials, historical societies, and law enforcement agencies, creating a network of unwitting collaborators who had unknowingly assisted his search for the missing Nazi treasure. Theodore's documentation revealed that these men hadn't simply been searching randomly. They had developed sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations that monitored estate sales, property transfers, and genealogical research throughout Connecticut and neighboring states. They had been looking specifically for evidence of wartime resistance activities, underground networks, and any families that might have been involved in protecting stolen assets during the 1940s. The most chilling discovery was a series of surveillance reports documenting occasions when these men had gotten close to identifying Theodore's operation. In 1987, the same year Catherine had died in her car accident, Heinrich Miller had actually visited Uncle Theodore's library, posing as a researcher interested in local history, while actually gathering information about longtime residents who might have been involved in wartime activities. Theodore's notes indicated his belief that Catherine's accident hadn't been accidental, that she had been murdered because the Nazi hunters had discovered her connection to the preservation network. Ryan found detailed maps showing that Richardson's construction company had purchased and developed properties throughout Millbrook Heights over the past 20 years, always choosing locations that had strategic value for monitoring Theodore's activities. The Victorian house at 1847 Sycamore Lane was surrounded by properties that Richardson's company had developed, creating a surveillance network that had been watching Uncle Theodore's house for decades. But Theodore had been more clever than his hunters realized. The flooding of his basement hadn't just been a preservation strategy. It had been psychological warfare, creating the appearance of a man who had given up and retreated into harmless eccentricity. For 24 years, Theodore had maintained the perfect cover, allowing his enemies to believe that he was a defeated recluse, while he continued gathering evidence that would eventually expose their war crimes. The financial implications of Theodore's discovery were staggering. Ryan found detailed appraisals indicating that the recovered artwork alone was worth approximately $180 million, while the Nazi gold bars represented another $100 million in stolen assets. But more importantly, Theodore had compiled evidence that would allow federal prosecutors to seize billions of dollars in assets that these war criminals had accumulated over 7 decades of hiding in America. Ryan discovered that Theodore had been in contact with special agents from the FBI's Art Crime Team, the Department of Justice's Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section, and investigators from the World Jewish Congress. But all of these communications had been conducted through elaborate security protocols, using coded language and intermediary contacts that protected Theodore's identity, while allowing him to share intelligence about Nazi activities in Connecticut. The most recent communications, dated just weeks before Theodore's death, revealed that federal investigators had finally gathered enough evidence to begin prosecution proceedings against the Nazi war criminals. But Theodore's death had created a critical problem. The investigators needed access to the physical evidence stored in his vault to complete their cases, and Theodore had taken his security procedures to the grave. Ryan found a sealed envelope marked Emergency Protocol Federal Contact Instructions that contained phone numbers and authentication codes for reaching the FBI agents who had been working with Theodore. But the instructions came with urgent warnings about operational security and the continuing danger posed by the Nazi network. "These men have spent 78 years evading justice," Theodore had written. "They have killed witnesses, corrupted officials, and eliminated anyone who threatened their security. The evidence in this vault represents their greatest vulnerability, but also their most desperate threat. They will stop at nothing to prevent this information from reaching federal prosecutors." Ryan realized that his discovery of the vault had started a countdown that could end either in historic justice or in his family's destruction. The Nazi war criminals had spent decades searching for exactly what Ryan had found, and Theodore's elaborate security measures were the only things that had prevented them from recovering their stolen wealth. But Theodore's death had created a window of opportunity that wouldn't remain open for long. The men who had murdered Catherine in 1987 would eventually discover that Theodore's heir had inherited more than just a flooded basement. When that happened, Ryan and his daughters would face the same lethal threat that had cost Catherine her life and had forced Theodore into 43 years of dangerous isolation. The phone numbers in Theodore's emergency envelope represented Ryan's only chance of completing his uncle's mission safely. But calling those numbers would also announce his discovery to federal investigators, who might not be able to protect his family from enemies who had spent nearly 8 decades perfecting the art of elimination. Standing in a vault filled with evidence of history's greatest art theft, Ryan understood that Uncle Theodore's inheritance came with a choice that would determine not just his family's financial future, but their survival. The $280 million in recovered Nazi plunder could solve every problem his family faced, but claiming it would require risking everything they had left to lose. Ryan picked up his phone and stared at the FBI contact number that Theodore had designated for emergencies. Making this call would begin the final phase of a justice operation that had been 43 years in development, but it would also announce to some of history's most dangerous criminals that Theodore's secret had finally been discovered. The vault door stood open behind him, revealing treasures that belonged to families who had been murdered for refusing to surrender them. Uncle Theodore had spent his life protecting those treasures and gathering evidence against the men who had stolen them. Now it was Ryan's turn to decide whether the pursuit of justice was worth the risk of becoming the next casualty in a war that had been raging since 1943. Ryan made the call at 6:47 a.m. using Theodore's encrypted contact instructions to reach Special Agent Catherine Morrison of the FBI's art crime team. The conversation that followed would forever change how he understood both his family's situation and the scope of the operation he had inherited. Agent Morrison's response to Ryan's authentication codes was immediate and urgent. "Mr. Smith, we've been waiting for this call for 6 months. Your uncle's death created a critical gap in an investigation that's been active since 1979. We need to meet immediately, but not at your location. These subjects have sophisticated surveillance capabilities, and they've been monitoring activity around your uncle's property since his funeral." The meeting took place at dawn in the parking lot of Riverside Medical Center, 15 miles from Millbrook Heights. Agent Morrison arrived with her partner, Special Agent David Chen, from the Department of Justice's Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section, and what they revealed about Uncle Theodore's work made Ryan understand that his discovery was just one piece of the largest Nazi war crimes investigation in American history. Your uncle wasn't just protecting stolen art," Agent Morrison explained, as she showed Ryan classified FBI photographs of the men Theodore had been surveilling. "He was the key witness in cases involving 6 Nazi war criminals who have been living in Connecticut under false identities for over 70 years. The evidence in his vault represents the culmination of a joint investigation involving the FBI, the Justice Department, Interpol, and intelligence agencies from 12 countries. Agent Chen opened a classified file that revealed the true scope of Operation Bernhard, the Nazi counterfeiting operation that had produced billions of dollars in fake currency and had been used to finance the theft of cultural treasures throughout occupied Europe. The men Theodore had been tracking weren't just individual war criminals, they were the surviving leadership of a network that had systematically looted the cultural heritage of entire nations. Heinrich Müller, Klaus Richter, and Wolfgang von Habsburg represent the operational command structure of one of the most successful art theft operations in history, Chen explained. They didn't just steal individual pieces, they organized the systematic plunder of museums, private collections, and religious institutions across 23 countries. The assets your uncle protected are valued at $280 million, but they represent evidence that could lead to the recovery of stolen property worth over $2 billion. Ryan learned that Theodore's intelligence gathering had been so valuable that federal prosecutors were preparing cases that could result in the largest asset forfeiture in American legal history. But the investigation had been complicated by the fact that all 3 Nazi criminals had used their wealth and influence to embed themselves within Connecticut's political and business establishment. Wolfgang von Habsburg has donated over $15 million to political campaigns in the past decade, Morrison revealed. His charitable foundation has relationships with the governor's office, both senators, and at least 8 congressmen. Klaus Richter's construction company has contracts with state and local governments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Heinrich Müller serves on the boards of 3 major museums and has been consulted by law enforcement agencies about art authentication and theft prevention. The irony was devastating. The Nazi war criminals had used their stolen wealth to purchase influence with the very institutions that should have been investigating them. They had created a protective network of political relationships, business connections, and charitable activities that made them appear to be model American citizens, while they continued searching for the evidence that could expose their true identities. But Theodore's 43 years of patient surveillance had documented everything. His files contained financial records proving that these men's American fortunes had been built entirely on stolen Nazi gold. He had gathered photographic evidence of private meetings where they had coordinated their search for missing assets. Most importantly, he had recorded conversations in which they had discussed their roles in wartime atrocities that would qualify them for prosecution under international war crimes statutes. Your uncle used his position as a librarian to create perfect cover for intelligence gathering, Chen explained. He had legitimate reasons to research historical records, genealogical information, and property transfers. He built relationships with historical societies, museum archivists, and government record keepers throughout New England. Over 4 decades, he assembled a more complete picture of Nazi activities in America than our intelligence agencies had been able to develop through official channels. Ryan discovered that Theodore's network had included other civilian investigators, Holocaust survivors, children of resistance fighters, and amateur historians who had dedicated their lives to tracking down war criminals who had escaped official justice. Theodore had been the coordinator for this informal network, using his librarian skills to organize and verify information that was then passed to federal investigators through secure channels. But the most shocking revelation was that Theodore's death hadn't been from natural causes. "We believe your uncle was murdered," Morrison said quietly. The timing of his death, just weeks before we were planning to execute search warrants and arrest warrants, was too convenient to be coincidental. We suspect that the Nazi network discovered his role in our investigation and eliminated him before he could testify. Ryan felt the ground shift beneath him as he understood that Uncle Theodore had been murdered for the same reason Catherine had died in 1987, because he had gotten too close to exposing men who would kill anyone who threatened their secrets. The inheritance that had seemed like such a burden was actually evidence in multiple murder cases, and Ryan's discovery of the vault had made him the next target for elimination. "The good news is that we're ready to move," Chen continued. "Your uncle's evidence gives us everything we need to arrest all three subjects and seize their assets under federal forfeiture statutes. But the operation has to happen quickly, before they realize that their security has been compromised." Agent Morrison outlined a plan that would require Ryan's cooperation and would put his family at considerable risk. Federal agents would need access to Theodore's vault to catalog evidence and remove the stolen artwork for authentication. They would need Ryan to testify about his uncle's activities and his discovery of the preservation facility. Most importantly, they would need Ryan to continue appearing to live his normal life, while federal agents prepared simultaneous raids on properties owned by all three Nazi war criminals. "We're talking about a coordinated operation involving over 200 federal agents," Morrison explained. "Search warrants for 37 properties in Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts. Arrest warrants for 6 individuals, including 3 who are currently serving on state government advisory committees. This is going to be the largest Nazi war crimes operation in American history." Ryan realized that his financial problems, which had seemed so overwhelming just days earlier, were about to become irrelevant. The federal government would provide witness protection for his family, and successful prosecution of the Nazi war criminals would result in reward payments that would secure his daughters' futures. But more importantly, completing Theodore's mission would ensure that stolen artwork worth hundreds of millions of dollars would finally be returned to the families and institutions from whom it had been taken. "Your uncle spent his entire adult life working toward this moment," Chen said as the meeting concluded. "He sacrificed everything: his social life, his family relationships, his reputation in the community, to gather the evidence that will finally bring these men to justice. Now it's up to you to decide whether you're willing to help us complete his mission." Ryan looked at the FBI identification cards that Morrison and Chen had shown him, understanding that accepting their partnership would transform him from a desperate father trying to save his house into a key witness in one of the most significant war crimes prosecutions in American history. The choice was no longer between financial security and continued poverty. It was between continuing Uncle Theodore's 43-year quest for justice and allowing some of history's most successful war criminals to escape accountability for crimes that had destroyed the lives of thousands of innocent families. Ryan took Agent Morrison's business card and made the decision that would define the rest of his life. 3 days after Ryan's meeting with the FBI agents, the surveillance began. It started subtly. A white panel van parked across from Madison's high school that hadn't been there the previous week. A man in a business suit photographing houses on Elmwood Street while pretending to be a real estate appraiser. And phone calls to the Smith residence that ended in silence when anyone answered. Ryan recognized the signs because Agent Morrison had warned him that the Nazi network would eventually notice increased activity around Theodore's property. The industrial pump rental, Ryan's multiple visits to the house, and the subtle changes in the neighborhood's routine would inevitably attract attention from men who had spent decades monitoring the area for exactly these kinds of developments. But the surveillance escalated quickly beyond what anyone had anticipated. On Thursday morning, Madison discovered that someone had been through her car during the night, searching the interior without taking anything valuable but leaving clear evidence that professional operators had been looking for something specific. The glove compartment had been opened and carefully rearranged. Her textbooks had been examined and restacked in a different order, and her phone charger had been disconnected and reconnected in a way that suggested someone had been checking for electronic monitoring devices. "Hey," Sophia's experience was more frightening. Walking home from Millbrook Heights Library after her part-time job, she noticed the same dark sedan following her route for 3 consecutive blocks. When she deliberately took a longer path through the residential neighborhood, the sedan maintained its distance, always staying exactly 2 blocks behind her movements. The driver was an elderly man wearing expensive clothing who appeared to be photographing her with a telephoto lens. Emma, the youngest and most observant of the 3 daughters, made the discovery that convinced Ryan that his family was in immediate danger. While helping her father organize paperwork for the FBI investigation, she found a GPS tracking device attached to the underside of Ryan's Honda Civic. The device was sophisticated, clearly expensive, and bore the logo of a private security company that specialized in surveillance equipment for law enforcement and corporate investigations. "Dad," Emma said as she handed him the tracking device, "whoever put this on our car knows everywhere we've been for the past week. They know you've been going to Uncle Theodore's house every day, and they probably know about your meeting with the FBI agents." Ryan called Agent Morrison immediately, using the secure phone number she had provided for emergencies. Her response was swift and alarming. "Mr. Smith, you and your family need to leave your house within the next 2 hours. Don't pack more than you can carry in a single trip, and don't tell anyone where you're going. We're moving the operation timeline up by 2 weeks." The emergency relocation took Ryan and his daughters to a safe house in Springfield, Massachusetts, a nondescript ranch home in a middle-class neighborhood that the FBI used for protecting witnesses in high-stakes federal investigations. The house was comfortable but clearly temporary, equipped with security systems, encrypted communication equipment, and armed federal marshals who maintained 24-hour protection. Agent Chen arrived at the safe house that evening with intelligence that explained why the Nazi network had escalated their surveillance so quickly. "We intercepted communications indicating that Heinrich Müller has been in contact with former Stasi officers who now operate private intelligence firms in Germany," Chen explained. "They've been providing him with surveillance technology and operational support that's far more sophisticated than anything a typical criminal organization would possess." The revelation that East German secret police veterans were assisting the Nazi war criminals added a new dimension to the threat Ryan's family was facing. These weren't just elderly war criminals trying to protect their secrets. They were part of an international network that included some of the most skilled intelligence operatives from the Cold War era. Klaus Richter's construction company has contracts with the Connecticut Department of Transportation and 3 municipal police departments, Morrison added. He's been using his legitimate business relationships to access government surveillance systems, traffic cameras, and law enforcement databases. When you started visiting your uncle's property regularly, his network was able to track your movements through official systems that most criminals could never penetrate. Ryan learned that Wolfgang von Habsburg's charitable foundation had been even more insidious in its intelligence-gathering activities. For over 20 years, the foundation had sponsored community events, historical preservation projects, and educational programs throughout Connecticut. These activities had provided cover for systematic information gathering about local families, property ownership patterns, and any individuals who might have connections to wartime resistance activities. Habsburg's people have been creating detailed genealogical profiles of every family in Millbrook Heights for the past 2 decades, Chen revealed. They've been looking specifically for descendants of people who might have been involved in protecting stolen assets during the 1940s. Your uncle's family history made you a person of interest long before you inherited his property. The most disturbing intelligence came from wiretaps that federal agents had recently installed on Habsburg's private telephone lines. The recordings revealed that the Nazi network had identified Ryan as Theodore's heir within days of the will being read, and they had been planning their surveillance operation since Uncle Theodore's funeral 6 months earlier. "They know about the vault," Morrison said quietly. "They don't know exactly what's inside it, but they know that Theodore was protecting something valuable enough to justify 43 years of secrecy. They've been waiting for you to discover whatever he was hiding, and then they were planning to eliminate your family and recover their stolen assets." Ryan realized that his family's mockery of Uncle Theodore's inheritance had actually been protective. By treating the flooded basement as a worthless burden, they had unknowingly maintained the cover story that had kept Theodore safe for decades. But Ryan's recent activities, the pump rental, the extended visits to the house, the obvious excitement about his discoveries, had shattered that protective deception. "The good news is that we're ready to execute the arrests," Chen continued. "We have search warrants for 43 properties, arrest warrants for 8 individuals, and asset forfeiture orders that will allow us to seize approximately $500 million in stolen wealth. But we need your family to remain in protective custody until the operation is complete. Madison, Sophia, and Emma had been listening to the briefing with the serious attention that their situation demanded. At 18, 16, and 14 respectively, they were old enough to understand that they had become targets in a war that had been raging since before their grandparents were born, but young enough to find the entire situation both terrifying and surreal. "How long do we have to stay here?" Madison asked, thinking about her high school graduation that was now just 8 weeks away. "The arrests will happen simultaneously in 3 days," Morrison replied. "If everything goes according to plan, you should be able to return to your normal lives within a week. But you need to understand that completing this operation will make your family permanently famous. The evidence your father discovered will be used in trials that will receive international media attention. Your uncle's story will be told in documentaries, books, and probably movies." Ryan looked at his daughters and realized that Uncle Theodore's inheritance had given them something far more valuable than financial security. It had given them the opportunity to complete one of the most important justice operations in modern history, to ensure that stolen cultural treasures were returned to the families from whom they had been taken, and to bring Nazi war criminals to justice after 78 years of impunity. But it had also made them permanent enemies of an international criminal network that had demonstrated its willingness to kill anyone who threatened its secrets. The next 72 hours would determine whether Uncle Theodore's 43-year mission would finally succeed, or whether the Nazi war criminals would claim their final victims before federal agents could stop them. As Ryan tucked his daughters into beds in a safe house that felt more like a bunker than a home, he understood that they were no longer just trying to save their house in Millbrook Heights. They were trying to complete a mission that had cost Uncle Theodore and Catherine their lives, and that would either bring justice to some of history's most successful criminals or result in their own destruction. The countdown to the largest Nazi war crimes operation in American history had begun. The safe house's secure communication system crackled to life at 4:17 a.m. with an emergency transmission that shattered any hope Ryan had maintained about a routine federal operation. Agent Morrison's voice carried an urgency that made Ryan's stomach clench with dread as she delivered intelligence that changed everything about their situation. "Mr. Smith, we have a critical development. Wolfgang von Habsburg's network has been more extensive than we realized. We've discovered that they have informants within the Connecticut State Police, the Hartford FBI field office, and at least 3 federal agencies in Washington. Our operation has been compromised from the beginning." Ryan sat up in the unfamiliar bed, processing the implications of Morrison's words while his daughters slept in adjacent rooms, unaware that their protection had just evaporated. The Nazi network hadn't just been monitoring Ryan's family, they had been monitoring the federal investigation itself, using corrupted law enforcement contacts to stay ahead of every move the FBI had planned. "How bad is it?" Ryan asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "Bad enough that we're initiating emergency protocols," Morrison replied. "The simultaneous arrests we planned for tomorrow have been postponed indefinitely. Habsburg's people know the locations of our surveillance posts. They know the identities of our undercover agents, and they may know about your family's location in Springfield." Agent Chen's voice joined the conference call with intelligence that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Ryan's family was facing. "We've learned that Heinrich Müller has been operating a private intelligence network that includes former CIA officers, retired military special operations personnel, and international mercenaries. These aren't just elderly war criminals hiding in Connecticut. They're part of a sophisticated criminal organization with resources that rival some government agencies." The revelation that the Nazi network had evolved into a modern criminal enterprise explained how they had remained undetected for 7 decades. They hadn't simply been hiding from justice. They had been actively infiltrating the institutions that should have been investigating them, using their stolen wealth to corrupt officials and eliminate threats before they could develop into serious challenges. "Klaus Richter's construction company has been more than just a cover operation," Chen continued. "We've discovered that his projects have included the installation of surveillance equipment in government buildings, law enforcement facilities, and private residences throughout Connecticut. His network has been monitoring communications and activities on a scale that we're still trying to understand." Ryan learned that federal investigators had been fighting a war they didn't know they were losing. For decades, FBI agents and Justice Department prosecutors had been building cases against Nazi war criminals while unknowingly sharing their intelligence with informants who reported directly to the subjects of their investigations. Your uncle was the only investigator who understood the true scope of their infiltration, Morrison explained. That's why he worked alone, why he never trusted official channels, and why he spent 43 years gathering evidence without revealing his activities to law enforcement agencies. He knew that approaching the FBI directly would result in his elimination. The safe house that had seemed so secure just hours earlier now felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Federal marshals who were supposed to be protecting Ryan's family might be reporting their location to the very criminals they were hiding from. Communication systems that were supposed to be encrypted might be monitored by enemy agents with access to government decryption technology. But the most terrifying intelligence came from intercepted communications that revealed the Nazi network's immediate plans. They're not just trying to recover the stolen assets, Chen revealed. They've decided that the evidence your uncle gathered represents an existential threat that requires permanent elimination. They're planning to destroy the vault, eliminate your family, and remove any possibility that their war crimes will ever be exposed. Ryan understood that Uncle Theodore's inheritance had become a death sentence for anyone associated with it. The $280 million in recovered Nazi plunder was valuable enough to justify murder, but the evidence of war crimes and the documentation of modern criminal activities was worth killing entire families to suppress. "What are our options?" Ryan asked, though he suspected the answer would be limited and dangerous. "We're implementing a protocol that your uncle designed for exactly this situation," Morrison replied. Theodore anticipated that the federal investigation might be compromised, and he created contingency plans for exposing the Nazi network through civilian channels that couldn't be infiltrated or corrupted. Agent Chen explained that Uncle Theodore had prepared what he called a dead man's switch, a system for releasing evidence simultaneously to multiple international news organizations, foreign intelligence agencies, and civilian investigative groups that operated independently of American law enforcement. The system was designed to create so much public exposure that the Nazi network would be unable to suppress the information or eliminate all the people who possessed it. But activating Theodore's dead man's switch requires physical access to his vault, Chen continued. The documentation is stored on systems that can only be operated from the basement facility, and the transmission codes are embedded in the vault's security systems. Someone has to return to Millbrook Heights and risk exposure to complete your uncle's final protocol. Ryan realized that the federal agents were asking him to become the bait in a trap that would either expose the Nazi network or result in his death. Returning to Uncle Theodore's house would alert the surveillance systems the Habsburg's people had established throughout the neighborhood. But it would also provide the only opportunity to complete Theodore's mission and ensure that his 43 years of work wouldn't be destroyed along with Ryan's family. The girls would have to remain in protective custody, Morrison added. We can't guarantee their safety if they're anywhere near the operation zone, but we also can't guarantee their safety if they remain in our custody, given the extent of the network's infiltration into federal agencies. Ryan found himself facing a choice that echoed the decision Uncle Theodore had made decades earlier: risk everything to pursue justice, or accept that some criminals are too powerful and too well protected to face consequences for their actions. But Ryan's decision would determine not just his own fate, but the future of his 3 daughters, and the eventual resolution of one of history's most successful criminal conspiracies. "There's something else you need to know," Chen said quietly. "We've learned that your wife Jennifer's death 4 years ago may not have been from natural causes. The medical records show anomalies that are consistent with poisoning, and the timeline corresponds with increased surveillance of your family that began around the same time. The Nazi network may have been eliminating threats to their security for much longer than we realized." The possibility that Jennifer had been murdered because of her connection to Uncle Theodore's mission made Ryan's decision inevitable. The men who had killed his wife, murdered his uncle, and destroyed Catherine's life in 1987 were now threatening his daughters. Completing Theodore's dead man's switch wasn't just about historical justice. It was about protecting his family from an enemy that had been targeting them for years. "I'll do it," Ryan said, making the decision that would either end the Nazi network's 78-year crime spree or result in his own addition to their list of victims. "Tell me what I need to know about Uncle Theodore's final protocol." As Agent Morrison began explaining the technical procedures for activating Theodore's evidence distribution system, Ryan realized that he was about to complete a mission that had consumed 3 generations of his family. Uncle Theodore had spent his life gathering evidence against Nazi war criminals. Catherine had died protecting that evidence. Jennifer had been murdered for her potential connection to Theodore's activities. Now it was Ryan's turn to risk everything for the possibility that some forms of justice are worth any personal cost. In 48 hours, he would either expose one of history's most successful criminal conspiracies or become its final victim before the truth could be revealed. The war that had begun in 1943 was finally approaching its conclusion, and Ryan Smith was about to discover whether courage and determination could triumph over corruption and violence that had protected Nazi war criminals for nearly 8 decades. The return to Uncle Theodore's house happened at 3:47 a.m. under cover of a thunderstorm that provided both concealment and an ominous soundtrack to what Ryan knew might be his final mission. Agent Morrison had coordinated the approach with military precision, using weather radar and surveillance intelligence to identify a window when Habsburg's monitoring systems would be compromised by atmospheric interference. Ryan wore body armor beneath his civilian clothes and carried encrypted communication equipment that would allow Morrison's team to track his movements through the house. But they had also been forced to acknowledge that if the Nazi network had been monitoring federal communications for decades, even the most sophisticated encryption might be compromised. Ryan was essentially walking into enemy territory with no guarantee that his backup would arrive in time to prevent his elimination. The basement vault opened with the same mechanical precision that had impressed Ryan during his first discovery, but now the space felt different, charged with the knowledge that everything stored within represented evidence that powerful men had killed to suppress. The stolen artwork seemed to watch Ryan as he navigated through Uncle Theodore's preservation facility toward the computer terminals that would activate the dead man's switch protocol. Theodore's documentation had been meticulous in describing the activation procedures, but Ryan discovered that his uncle had built multiple safeguards into the system that required both technical knowledge and personal information that only a family member would possess. The first security layer required Ryan to input biographical details about Catherine's life, including dates and locations that weren't recorded in any official documents. The second layer demanded information about Theodore's library career, including the titles of specific books and the names of patrons who had visited during particular years. But it was the third security layer that revealed the depth of Theodore's planning and his understanding of the dangers his heir would face. The system required Ryan to answer questions about Jennifer's death that only someone with intimate knowledge of her final months would know. Theodore had been monitoring Ryan's family for years, gathering personal information that would serve as the ultimate authentication system for activating his evidence distribution network. The computer terminal displayed Theodore's final message as Ryan successfully navigated through the security protocols. "My dear nephew, if you are reading this, then the enemies we have fought for so long have finally discovered our family's role in preserving justice. What you are about to activate will expose 78 years of war crimes, murder, and corruption, but it will also make you a permanent target for criminals who have spent decades eliminating anyone who threatened their secrets." Ryan's hands trembled as he read the technical specifications for Theodore's dead man's switch. The system would simultaneously transmit complete documentation to 47 news organizations across 12 countries, intelligence agencies in 17 nations, and civilian investigation groups that had been tracking Nazi war criminals since the 1940s. The evidence would include financial records, surveillance photographs, recorded conversations, and testimony from witnesses who had been secretly cooperating with Theodore's investigation for decades. But Theodore's message continued with a warning that made Ryan understand the true scope of what he was about to unleash. The activation of this system will trigger immediate retaliation from the Nazi network. They will attempt to eliminate you, your family, and anyone else who possesses knowledge of their activities. You must be prepared for a war that will not end until either all of them are dead or imprisoned, or until they have successfully eliminated everyone who can testify against them. Ryan began the activation sequence, watching as Theodore's computer systems established encrypted connections with servers in Switzerland, Israel, Germany, and 8 other countries. The data transmission would take approximately 47 minutes to complete, during which time Ryan would be trapped in the basement vault, while Habsburg's people undoubtedly mobilized every resource they possessed to stop the evidence from reaching its destinations. Agent Morrison's voice crackled through Ryan's communication equipment with intelligence that confirmed his worst fears. "Ryan, we're detecting multiple vehicles approaching your location from different directions. It appears that the Nazi network has decided to risk everything on a direct assault rather than allowing the evidence transmission to complete." Through the basement's small windows, Ryan could see vehicle lights moving through the storm toward Uncle Theodore's house. The Nazi network wasn't just sending surveillance operatives. They were mounting what appeared to be a military-style operation designed to breach the house, eliminate Ryan, and destroy the vault's contents before the evidence could reach international recipients. But Theodore had anticipated even this scenario. Hidden within the vault were weapons, ammunition, and defensive equipment that Uncle Theodore had accumulated over 4 decades of preparation for a final confrontation with the criminals he had been tracking. Ryan found detailed tactical instructions that Theodore had written for defending the basement facility against armed assault, including specific procedures for using the vault's architecture and the house's structural features to create defensive advantages. The first indication that Ryan's position was under assault came when the house's electrical power was cut, plunging the basement into darkness except for the glow of Theodore's computer terminals running on backup battery systems. The power cut was followed by the sound of multiple entry points being breached simultaneously: front door, back door, and basement windows that provided direct access to the underground facility. Ryan activated the vault's defensive systems that Theodore had installed, sealing the main entrance and triggering security measures that would slow but not stop a determined assault. Through his communication equipment, he could hear Agent Morrison coordinating FBI response teams, but it was clear that federal agents were still at least 15 minutes away from reaching the house. The Nazi operatives who had breached the basement were professional soldiers, not elderly war criminals. Their tactical movements and sophisticated equipment indicated that Habsburg's network had recruited mercenaries with military special operations experience. These men weren't just trying to recover stolen assets, they were conducting a precision elimination operation designed to leave no witnesses and no evidence of their involvement. But Uncle Theodore's 43 years of preparation had created advantages that even professional soldiers couldn't immediately overcome. The basement's layout included hidden passages, reinforced barriers, and defensive positions that allowed Ryan to observe his attackers while remaining concealed. More importantly, Theodore's dead man's switch continued transmitting evidence to international recipients while the assault was ongoing, creating a race between the completion of the data transfer and the operatives' efforts to reach the computer terminals. Ryan found himself in a situation that perfectly paralleled Uncle Theodore's entire adult life, defending evidence of Nazi war crimes while under attack from criminals who would stop at nothing to suppress the truth. But unlike Theodore, who had fought his war alone for decades, Ryan was part of a coordinated operation that included federal agents, international investigators, and civilian allies who had been waiting 78 years for this moment. The storm outside intensified as the confrontation inside reached its critical phase. Ryan watched the transmission progress indicator showing that 31 minutes remained before Theodore's evidence would reach irreversible distribution. The Nazi operatives had 31 minutes to breach the vault's defenses, eliminate Ryan, and destroy the computer systems that were broadcasting their war crimes to the world. Standing in a vault filled with $280 million in recovered Nazi plunder, surrounded by evidence that would expose some of history's most successful criminals, Ryan understood that the next half hour would determine whether Uncle Theodore's life's work would finally achieve justice, or whether the Nazi network would claim their final victory before the truth could be revealed. The sound of cutting torches against the vault door announced that the final phase of a 78-year war was about to begin. Ryan Smith, unemployed quality control supervisor and desperate father of 3, was about to become the last line of defense in one of the most important justice operations in modern history. The cutting torches breached the vault door with 18 minutes remaining on Theodore's transmission countdown, but what happened next shattered every assumption Ryan had made about the forces arrayed against him. Instead of Nazi operatives storming through the opening, Agent Morrison stepped into the vault with her weapon drawn, but pointed at Ryan rather than at any external threat. "Mr. Smith, please step away from the computer terminals," Morrison said with the cold professionalism of someone executing a long-planned operation The transmission needs to be terminated immediately. Ryan's mind struggled to process what he was seeing as Agent Chen appeared behind Morrison, followed by 3 individuals in tactical gear who were definitely not FBI personnel. The realization that the federal agents he had trusted with his family's lives were actually working for the Nazi network felt like a physical blow that left him struggling to breathe. "You're one of them," Ryan said, the words coming out as barely a whisper as he understood the true scope of the conspiracy Uncle Theodore had been fighting. "I'm one of the people who understand that some secrets are too dangerous to expose," Morrison replied. "Your uncle spent 43 years gathering evidence that would destabilize international relationships, compromise ongoing intelligence operations, and destroy the lives of people who have spent decades serving American interests in ways that require absolute discretion." Agent Chen moved to the computer terminals and began entering commands designed to halt Theodore's evidence transmission. But the system's security protocols prevented immediate termination, creating a technological standoff that gave Ryan precious minutes to understand what was really happening. "Wolfgang von Habsburg has been one of the CIA's most valuable assets for 30 years, Chen explained as he worked to override Theodore's dead man's switch. His network provided intelligence about Soviet activities during the Cold War, helped identify terrorist financing operations in the 1990s, and has been instrumental in tracking international criminal organizations that threaten American security. The evidence your uncle compiled would expose operations that are still active and still protecting American lives." Ryan realized that Uncle Theodore had been fighting something far more complex than a simple Nazi war criminal network. The men he had been tracking had been incorporated into American intelligence operations, their wartime crimes overlooked in exchange for their continued service to government agencies that valued their results more than their methods. Heinrich Muller's art authentication expertise has helped the FBI recover stolen cultural property worth over $500 million, Morrison continued. Klaus Richter's construction company has provided cover for surveillance operations in 12 countries. These men's past crimes are irrelevant compared to their ongoing contributions to American national security. But Ryan's communication equipment crackled with a transmission that revealed Morrison and Chen's deception. A new voice joined the conversation. Agent Sarah Walsh from the Justice Department's Internal Affairs Division, speaking from a command post that was apparently coordinating the real federal operation. "Agent Morrison, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to harbor war criminals, and treason," Walsh announced. "The operation you've been sabotaging for the past 6 months represents a joint investigation involving the Justice Department, Interpol, and intelligence agencies from 14 countries. Your interference with this investigation constitutes one of the most serious breaches of federal law enforcement integrity in American history." Ryan watched Morrison's expression shift from professional confidence to desperate calculation as she realized that her own operation had been compromised. The Nazi network's infiltration of federal agencies had been detected and countered by investigators who had been secretly building cases against corrupted officials for years. "The real FBI team is 3 minutes out," Walsh continued through Ryan's communication system. "Mr. Smith, continue the transmission protocol. Agent Morrison and Agent Chen are not authorized federal personnel. They're private contractors working for intelligence agencies that have been protecting war criminals for political purposes." Ryan understood that he had been caught in the middle of a war within the American intelligence community, a conflict between agencies that wanted to use Nazi war criminals as assets and investigators who believed that some crimes were too serious to ignore, regardless of their political utility. Uncle Theodore's evidence would expose not just the war criminals themselves, but the government officials who had been protecting them for decades. Morrison made her desperation clear by drawing her weapon and pointing it directly at Ryan's chest. "The transmission stops now, or you join your uncle and your wife in whatever afterlife they found." The admission that Morrison's people had murdered both Theodore and Jennifer confirmed what Ryan had suspected since learning about the conspiracy. The Nazi network's American protectors had been eliminating threats for decades, using their government positions to investigate, target, and eliminate civilians who posed risks to their operations. But Morrison's threat was interrupted by sounds that indicated the real federal operation was finally reaching Uncle Theodore's house. Explosions from multiple directions suggested that FBI tactical teams were breaching the property, using methods that overwhelmed the Nazi operatives who had been maintaining perimeter security. "You have 90 seconds to surrender before this basement becomes a combat zone," Walsh announced through the communication system. "Mr. Smith, remain in the vault and allow the transmission to complete. We've been waiting 6 years for this evidence to reach international recipients." Ryan realized that Uncle Theodore's dead man's switch had been designed not just to expose Nazi war criminals, but to reveal the extent of their protection by American intelligence agencies. The evidence being transmitted would end careers, trigger international investigations, and potentially result in criminal charges against government officials who had prioritized political expediency over justice. Chen made a final desperate attempt to terminate the transmission by physically attacking the computer terminals, but Theodore's security systems prevented tampering through electrical countermeasures that disabled anyone who attempted unauthorized access. Chen collapsed as the system defended itself, leaving Morrison alone with Ryan and 11 minutes remaining on the transmission countdown. "Your daughters are in protective custody with people who work for the same agencies I represent," Morrison said, making her final threat explicit. "If this transmission completes, Madison, Sophia, and Emma will disappear into systems that don't acknowledge their existence. Their only chance of survival is your cooperation in terminating your uncle's final operation." Ryan faced the choice that had defined Uncle Theodore's entire adult life: personal safety versus historical justice. But Ryan's decision was made easier by Walsh's voice providing real-time intelligence about his family's actual situation. "Mr. Smith, your daughters are secure with legitimate federal marshals at a facility in western Massachusetts," Walsh reported. "Agent Morrison's claims about their custody are false. She has no authority over your family's protection, and her threats are evidence of additional federal crimes that will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." The vault door exploded inward as FBI tactical teams breached Theodore's final defensive barrier, with 8 minutes remaining on the transmission countdown. Ryan watched Morrison and the remaining operatives surrender to federal agents who had been fighting the same war Uncle Theodore had been waging for 43 years. As Ryan stood among the recovered Nazi treasures while Theodore's evidence completed its distribution to international recipients, he understood that his uncle's inheritance had been far more valuable than $280 million in stolen artwork and gold. It had been the key to exposing a conspiracy that had protected war criminals for 7 decades and had corrupted American intelligence agencies through the promise of continued cooperation from men whose expertise had been purchased with immunity from prosecution. The transmission completed with Agent Walsh confirming that Theodore's evidence had reached all 47 intended recipients simultaneously. After 78 years, the truth about Nazi war crimes in America was finally beyond the reach of anyone who wanted to suppress it for political convenience. Uncle Theodore's 43-year mission was complete, and Ryan Smith had become the witness whose testimony would ensure that some of history's most successful criminals would finally face justice for crimes that had been protected by governments that valued their services more than their victims' lives. The aftermath of Theodore's evidence transmission unfolded with a speed and scope that made international headlines within hours of its completion. By dawn, news organizations across 12 countries were broadcasting simultaneous reports about the largest Nazi war crimes exposure in modern history, featuring documentation that implicated not just the original war criminals, but decades of government officials who had protected them for political purposes. Ryan found himself at the center of a media storm that transformed him overnight from an unemployed factory worker facing foreclosure into the key witness in prosecutions that would reshape how the world understood the post-war integration of Nazi operatives into Western intelligence agencies. But more importantly, he was finally reunited with Madison, Sophia, and Emma at a secure federal facility where Agent Walsh briefed the family on the extraordinary scope of what Theodore's evidence had revealed. "Your uncle's documentation has triggered simultaneous investigations in 14 countries," Walsh explained as she showed the Smith family classified briefings that outlined the global impact of Theodore's 43-year intelligence-gathering operation. "We're looking at prosecutions involving over 200 individuals, asset forfeitures exceeding $3 billion, and the recovery of stolen cultural property that museums have been searching for since 1945. The immediate arrests had been even more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Heinrich Müller, Klaus Richter, and Wolfgang von Habsburg were in federal custody facing charges that included war crimes, conspiracy, racketeering, and multiple counts of murder spanning 7 decades. But the investigation had also exposed a network of American officials whose protection of these criminals constituted some of the most serious corruption cases in federal law enforcement history. Agent Morrison and Agent Chen were part of a CIA operation that began in 1979, Walsh continued. They weren't just protecting individual war criminals. They were managing an entire network of former Nazi operatives who had been integrated into American intelligence operations during the Cold War. Your uncle's evidence documents systematic violations of international law that were authorized at the highest levels of government. Madison, Sophia, and Emma listened to these revelations with the amazement of young people discovering that their quiet family history was connected to some of the most significant events of the 20th century. But Ryan was more focused on understanding how Theodore's inheritance would affect their immediate future and long-term security. The financial implications are substantial, Walsh explained. Federal asset forfeiture laws allow the government to seize all property that was purchased with proceeds from criminal enterprises. The Nazi network's American assets, real estate, business holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid capital, represent approximately $3.2 billion that will be distributed to Holocaust survivor organizations, cultural institutions, and families whose property was stolen during the war. Ryan learned that his family would receive a substantial finder's fee for their role in exposing the conspiracy, but more importantly, they would be eligible for compensation under federal witness protection programs that provided financial security and ongoing safety measures. The foreclosure notice that had driven Ryan to pump out Theodore's basement was now irrelevant. His family's financial problems had been permanently resolved by their uncle's inheritance. But the most meaningful discovery came when federal investigators cataloged the stolen artwork in Theodore's vault. Among the recovered pieces were paintings, sculptures, and religious artifacts that had been stolen from specific Jewish families during the Holocaust. The World Jewish Congress had been able to identify the original owners of 63 items, including artwork that had belonged to families who had assumed their cultural heritage had been destroyed forever. Your uncle maintained detailed provenance records for every piece in his collection, Walsh explained. He spent decades tracking down the descendants of families whose property had been stolen, documenting their histories and preserving evidence that would allow for eventual restitution. Some of these families had been searching for their stolen property for 78 years. Ryan watched his daughters absorb the magnitude of what Uncle Theodore had accomplished through 4 decades of patient, dangerous work. Theodore hadn't just been hiding stolen treasures. He had been preserving the cultural heritage of families whose histories had been systematically destroyed by Nazi theft operations. The restitution ceremonies began within weeks of the arrests, as federal investigators worked with international organizations to return stolen artwork to families who had given up hope of ever recovering their ancestors' property. Ryan and his daughters attended several of these ceremonies, witnessing the emotional reunions between Holocaust survivors and cultural artifacts that connected them to relatives who had been murdered decades earlier. "This painting belonged to my grandmother," said Rebecca Goldstein, a 74-year-old woman from New York who had traveled to Connecticut to reclaim a portrait that had hung in her family's Vienna apartment before the 1938 Nazi occupation. "I thought I would never see anything from my family's life before the war. Your uncle preserved not just the painting but the proof that my grandmother existed, that she had a life and possessions and dignity before they took everything away." These restitution ceremonies revealed the true value of Theodore's inheritance. The $280 million in recovered assets was significant, but the restoration of cultural identity to families who had been systematically robbed was priceless. Uncle Theodore had spent his life ensuring that Nazi theft operations wouldn't achieve their ultimate goal of erasing the cultural heritage of entire communities. The criminal prosecutions moved forward with unprecedented international cooperation. Wolfgang von Habsburg, despite his advanced age and attempts to claim diplomatic immunity through his charitable foundation connections, faced charges in American federal court that could result in life imprisonment. Heinrich Müller and Klaus Richter were extradited to Germany, where they would stand trial for war crimes that had no statute of limitations under international law. But the most significant prosecutions involved the American officials who had protected these criminals for political purposes. Agent Morrison, Agent Chen, and 17 other government employees faced federal charges that included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violations of international war crime statutes. Their trials would expose decades of policy decisions that had prioritized intelligence gathering over criminal justice. Your uncle understood that exposing this conspiracy would require more than just gathering evidence, Walsh explained during one of their final briefings. He had to create a system that would simultaneously inform the public, trigger international investigations, and provide legal documentation that couldn't be suppressed or destroyed by the same agencies that had been protecting these criminals. Ryan realized that Theodore's dead man's switch had been the culmination of a lifetime spent understanding how powerful criminals protected themselves through corruption and intimidation. By distributing evidence to multiple international recipients simultaneously, Theodore had ensured that no single government or agency could control the narrative or prevent prosecutions from moving forward. The Smith family's new home in Millbrook Heights was purchased with funds from the Federal Witness Protection Program, but it was located on Sycamore Lane, just 3 blocks from Uncle Theodore's restored Victorian house, which had been converted into a memorial and educational center dedicated to Holocaust remembrance and the recovery of stolen cultural property. Madison would begin her freshman year at Yale University on a full scholarship funded by the Theodore Blackwood Foundation for Holocaust Education. Sophia had been accepted to a prestigious summer program for young historians interested in human rights investigation. Emma had begun volunteering at the Memorial Center, helping to catalog and research the stories behind recovered artwork. But the most meaningful change in Ryan's life was the restoration of his family's reputation and his own understanding of their place in history. Uncle Theodore was no longer the neighborhood eccentric who had lived alone with his strange obsessions. He was recognized as one of the most important civilian investigators in the history of Nazi war crimes prosecution, a man who had sacrificed everything to ensure that justice would eventually triumph over political expediency. Standing in the memorial center that had once been Uncle Theodore's flooded basement, surrounded by photographs of recovered artwork and testimonials from families whose cultural heritage had been restored, Ryan understood that his inheritance had been far more valuable than money or property. It had been the opportunity to complete a mission of historical justice that would resonate for generations. The foreclosure notice that had driven him to pump out a basement full of stagnant water had led to the exposure of one of the most successful criminal conspiracies in modern history. Uncle Theodore's 43-year war against Nazi war criminals had finally ended in complete victory, and Ryan Smith had become the witness whose courage had ensured that some forms of justice are worth any personal risk. 2 years after the transmission that changed everything, Ryan Smith stood in the marble-floored lobby of the Smithsonian Institution, watching his daughter Madison deliver a keynote address to an international conference on Holocaust asset recovery. At 20, she had become one of the youngest researchers ever invited to speak at such a prestigious gathering, her presentation focusing on the digital preservation techniques that Uncle Theodore had pioneered decades before such technology became standard in archival science. The transformation in Ryan's family's circumstances still felt surreal at times. The modest 3-bedroom house they had once struggled to keep had been replaced by a restored colonial mansion on 12 acres in Millbrook Heights, purchased not with reward money but with income from the Theodore Blackwood Institute for Historical Justice, which Ryan now directed. The institute had grown from Uncle Theodore's documentation into an internationally recognized center for tracking stolen cultural property and supporting families seeking restitution for wartime losses. But the most profound changes were not financial. Emma, now 16, had developed into a formidable researcher whose work on genealogical reconstruction had helped reconnect dozens of families with their stolen heritage. Her summer internship with the FBI's art crime team had resulted in the recovery of 3 additional caches of Nazi-looted artwork, discoveries that validated Uncle Theodore's theory that systematic theft operations had hidden assets throughout New England during the 1940s. Sophia, 18 and preparing for her freshman year at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, had spent the previous summer working with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, assisting with prosecutions that grew directly from Uncle Theodore's evidence. Her fluency in German and French, languages she had learned specifically to help with restitution research, had made her invaluable to investigators tracking the financial networks that had supported Nazi operations for decades after the war's official end. The criminal prosecutions had exceeded even Agent Walsh's optimistic predictions. Wolfgang von Habsburg had died in federal prison while awaiting trial. but not before his extensive confession had implicated government officials in 17 countries who had knowingly protected war criminals for political advantages. Heinrich Müller and Klaus Richter had been convicted in German courts and sentenced to life imprisonment, though both men were unlikely to survive their sentences given their advanced ages and deteriorating health. More significantly, the prosecutions of American officials had resulted in systematic reforms within intelligence agencies that had operated with minimal oversight since the Cold War era. Congressional investigations triggered by Uncle Theodore's evidence had exposed decades of programs that had prioritized operational effectiveness over legal and moral considerations, leading to new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. Your uncle's work has fundamentally changed how we approach the intersection of intelligence gathering and criminal justice, said Dr. Elizabeth Hartmann, director of the Vienna-based Commission for Looted Art in Europe, as she joined Ryan during a break in the conference proceedings. The documentation he preserved has allowed us to resolve over 400 cases of stolen cultural property, returning artwork worth more than $800 million to families who had given up hope of ever recovering their heritage. The economic impact had been equally transformative for Holocaust survivor communities worldwide. The $3.2 billion in assets seized from the Nazi network had been distributed through a foundation that provided education, healthcare, and cultural preservation support for survivors and their descendants. But beyond the financial assistance, Uncle Theodore's evidence had provided something more valuable: official acknowledgement of crimes that had been denied or minimized for decades. Ryan's role as director of the Theodore Blackwood Institute had evolved far beyond what he could have imagined during those desperate days when foreclosure seemed inevitable. The institute operated programs in 12 countries, employed over 200 researchers and investigators, and maintained the world's most comprehensive database of Nazi cultural theft operations. But Ryan's most important responsibility was preserving and expanding Uncle Theodore's methodology for civilian investigation of historical crimes. Your uncle understood something that professional investigators often miss, explained Professor David Chen from Columbia University's Center for Human Rights Documentation, speaking at the conference's afternoon session. Historical justice requires patience, precision, and personal commitment that extends beyond the typical career spans of government employees. Civilian investigators, motivated by family connections and moral imperatives rather than professional advancement, often achieve results that elude official agencies. The Institute had begun training civilian investigators throughout Europe and North America, teaching Uncle Theodore's techniques for document preservation, genealogical research, and evidence authentication. These programs had already resulted in the discovery of additional Nazi asset caches in 7 countries, validating Theodore's belief that systematic cultural theft had hidden valuable assets in locations that had never been officially investigated. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Uncle Theodore's legacy was the restoration of individual family histories that had been deliberately destroyed by Nazi operations. The Institute's genealogical reconstruction program had helped over 3,000 families recover documentation of relatives who had been murdered during the Holocaust, providing evidence of lives and achievements that the Nazi regime had attempted to erase from historical records. "My great-grandfather was a renowned composer in Berlin before the war," said Sarah Brennan, a conference attendee whose family had recovered original musical manuscripts through the Institute's research. "For 70 years, we knew only that he had been murdered in Auschwitz. Your uncle's documentation proved that his compositions had been stolen and sold to American collectors who had no idea they were purchasing the cultural heritage of murder victims. Now those compositions are being performed again, and my great-grandfather's name is in music history books where it belongs." The afternoon concluded with the unveiling of a permanent exhibition at the Theodore Blackwood Memorial Center in Millbrook Heights, featuring interactive displays that allowed visitors to explore the detective work that had exposed the Nazi network's American operations. The exhibition included a recreation of Uncle Theodore's basement vault, complete with authentic documents and recovered artwork that illustrated the scope of systematic cultural theft during the Holocaust. As Ryan walked through the exhibition with his daughters, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a flooded basement and a foreclosure notice. The inheritance that his family had mocked as worthless had proven to be one of the most valuable discoveries in the history of Holocaust asset recovery, but more importantly, it had provided them with a mission that connected their personal struggles to one of the most important justice operations of the modern era. "Dad," Emma said as they paused before a display featuring Uncle Theodore's correspondence with Holocaust survivors, "do you think he knew what would happen when he left you the house?" Ryan considered the question while studying a photograph of Uncle Theodore from 1987, taken just months before Catherine's murder and years before he would flood his basement to protect his life's work. Theodore looked determined but lonely, a man who had already sacrificed normal relationships and conventional happiness for the pursuit of historical justice. "I think he knew that someday someone in our family would be desperate enough and curious enough to discover what he had been protecting," Ryan replied. "But I don't think he could have imagined that his work would grow into something this significant, or that it would give us a way to honor the memory of people whose stories had been deliberately hidden for so long." Madison joined the conversation with the perspective of someone who had spent 2 years researching Uncle Theodore's methodology and motivations. "He left detailed instructions for everything except what we should do after completing his mission," she observed. "I think he trusted us to decide how to use his inheritance in ways that would serve the families whose property he had been protecting." As evening fell over Millbrook Heights, the Smith family returned to their home on Sycamore Lane, just blocks from the memorial center that had once been Uncle Theodore's secret preservation facility. The foreclosure notice that had driven Ryan to pump out the basement was now framed in his office, a reminder of how desperate circumstances had led to one of the most important discoveries in Holocaust asset recovery. Ryan's final act each evening was to review applications from families around the world who were seeking the Institute's help in recovering stolen cultural property or locating documentation of relatives who had been murdered during the Holocaust. Each application represented a story that connected directly to Uncle Theodore's 43-year mission, families whose heritage had been preserved by a man who had sacrificed everything to ensure that some forms of historical truth could never be completely destroyed. Sometimes the most worthless-looking inheritance carries the most priceless legacy. Uncle Theodore had left his family more than $280 million in recovered Nazi plunder. He had left them the opportunity to complete a mission of historical justice that would honor the memory of murder victims and restore cultural heritage to families who had been systematically robbed of their identity. The flooded basement that had seemed like such a cruel joke had contained the keys to exposing one of history's most successful criminal conspiracies. And Ryan Smith, unemployed factory worker and desperate father, had become the guardian of a legacy that would ensure Uncle Theodore's war against Nazi war criminals would continue for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.